So, Chapter 12 is known as an age of reform when people are demanding a lot of change in America. So, without further ado, early on, people's participation in voluntary associations encourage reform. What do I mean by voluntary associations? Things like what church you belonged to, a fraternal order like the Freemasons, or the International Order of Oddfellows, or sometimes there were even like political clubs, like you would support a certain party or a certain group centered around a political issue. And really, this went to show that more and more and more people were becoming literate and consuming of the news. Remember, too, we talked about how in the Jacksonian period, more and more people can participate in the political system via voting. There's not as many landowning or tax-paying requirements. And Alexis de Tocqueville noticed when he traveled to the United States and then proceeded to write Democracy in America that there was a lot more political participation from the common man than ever before. And the big reason was not only the increase in the literacy rates, but also these voluntary associations, like I said, whether it be churches, these fraternal organizations, or political clubs. Religion obviously plays a central role in life in this time period. That's a mainstay of people's lives. And religion also tends to be at the center of many of these reform movements. Many areas of New England, which eventually spread beyond New England into New York, the Ohio River Valley, they came to be known as burned over districts. And why? Because they were fertile ground for reform movements, meaning that areas once ravaged by fire are extremely fertile afterwards. If you remember the concept of slash and burn farming in the ancient world, well, if you kind of play that out societally speaking, if you have newly settled territory that's fertile ground for people to want to participate in reform movements. And usually it's these lower class folks who moved out of more expensive regions of the country to less expensive regions of the country to live. And there are all sorts of reform movements that these common folks support. The temperance movement, which eventually becomes known as the prohibition movement, abolition of slavery, anti-violence, pacifism, and then also women's rights. So these are all really popular in these lower class burned over districts, shall we say. You can see here one particular religious group, the Shakers. This is actually taken directly from your textbook. But probably the most well-known reform movement is abolitionism, because it eventually is resolved only by civil war. Religious views made it possible for people to wrap their brain around the issue of slavery via their religion. If they viewed things like alcohol consumption as a sin, well, maybe slave ownership is also a sin. So this is actually known as extreme moralism. The more radical changes, though, when people supported like an immediate end to slavery, came to be known in the early years of the abolition movement as militant abolitionism, because a lot of other people who didn't support immediate emancipation, but rather gradual emancipation, would say these crazy militant abolitionists want immediate abolition. So, abolitionism really was supported, again, as most of these reform movements were, by religious views. This was a sin. God would not want any of humanity living in the kinds of conditions that slaves lived in. So abolitionism, like the others, is very much backed up by religious rhetoric. You can see here the famous heading to the famous newspaper, abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator, which was run by William Lloyd Garrison. Now, the market revolution and the concept of free labor. Abolitionists really helped to popularize this concept. And really, that people owned not only property, but they owned one's self and the ability to enjoy the fruits of one's labor. So not only can you own a home and other forms of property, but you own yourself. So abolitionists would fight back at the term wage slavery, which had been popularized by the era's labor movement, and Southerners who were defending the slave system in the South by saying, well, at least the person has the choice to move from one job to the next to seek something better for themselves. They're not trapped in a particular lifestyle forever. So they compared a person working for wages to slaves as that exact freedom of movement, freedom to gradually better yourself versus the being trapped in the world of slavery. And the abolitionist William Goodell was quoted as saying that slavery deprived human beings of their, quote, grand central right, the inherent right of self-ownership. Now, a lot of folks think of the antebellum period as these racist pro-slavery Southerners versus these gloriously wonderful Northerners. And believe it or not, yes, there's even racists in the North. Southerners had very obvious reasons to support the slave system because that was their lifeblood. That was how they made a living. Northerners, however, were, and a perfect word for this is complacent with slavery, as well as very racist and discriminatory against freed blacks in the North. The biggest reason that they were racists and allowed for slavery to continue despite the fact that they did not directly benefit from slavery was that they were worried about losing their jobs to freed slaves. This is very similar. We will come back to this later in the course, talking about anti-immigration movements later in the course. Very similar argument here, the they took our jobs mentality. Now these images that I've used over here, there's a man in the movie Glory who's depicted here and here. Now the character's name is Sergeant Major Mulcahy, and he is in charge of training this regiment of all black troops, which is the 54th Massachusetts Infantry that the movie Glory is based upon. So he's only in the film for a brief amount of time during their training, and he is particularly rough on these black recruits and says all sorts of awful racist things to them during training. And in the film anyway, he kind of gains respect for them as they become well-trained soldiers. That might not necessarily be a realistic thing due to what a rampant racist he was. The likelihood that someone overcomes that and sees the light, we all know, is unfortunately very rare. But anyway, he very well depicts that in the North, yes, even in the Union Army that was fighting to eradicate slavery, that there was plenty of racism. Now, this concept of I'm fighting for their rights, what about mine? Women participated in the abolition movement. They were active participants, oftentimes in lockstep with their husbands, to end slavery, learning how to fight for rights in the political arena, what the political cogwheels of the system were like, and in the years following the Civil War, this leads to an accelerated women's rights movement. They use those things that they learned fighting for abolition to advocate for their own rights. This Civil War really provided a great opportunity for women to prove themselves working in industry, being battlefield nurses, being an integral part of the war effort, and saying, hey, we contributed to the war effort just as much as everybody else. We want to be full-fledged citizens as well. And believe it or not, early demands from women's rights activists had very little to do with voting and much to do with societal norms like property ownership, the having of your own bank account, being able to take and hold a job if you so chose, and the gradual feminism of this time leads to more education for women, more working women, etc., and then, yes, eventually the full-fledged women's suffrage movement. One of probably women's greatest allies in this argument of we deserve to be treated like full citizens was Clara Barton, the Civil War nurse who also is the founder of the American Red Cross, very much a proponent of women's abilities to be full citizens, just as effective citizens as men. And this really is kind of a symbol, even used later by suffragettes, equal rights amendment supporters in the 1970s. People looked to symbols like Clara Barton for inspiration later in those movements as well. This is the end of this brief Chapter 12 lecture. If you have any questions, by all means reach out to me, and otherwise I'll see you in class.